you go down and then you go up to make it better, make it better. Down on the ground, it's just one way up. Make it better, make it better. If you stand by me, I will stand by you. To make it better, make it better.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Rise Up with Rebecca Seawright on the Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I'm Assemblymember Rebecca Seawright, representing the Upper East Side, Yorkville, and Roosevelt Island, and hosting tonight from our state capital in Albany. Tonight, we will be talking about the impacts of climate change on the environment with Blair Horner, Executive Director of the New York Public Interest Research Group, known as NYPIRG. Climate change is the greatest global threat. Sea levels are rising with an estimated 6 to 9 inches of sea level rise by 2050. We can get ahead of the problem as the amount of sea level rise is dependent on future greenhouse gas emissions. There is more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere from burning fossil fuels. Temperatures are rising. We are witnessing extreme weather and drought causing wildfires in the West. All of these conditions have catastrophic impacts on our communities. One of my first acts in office was to fight the ill-conceived waste transfer station on East 91st Street in Yorkville and the ill impacts on the air quality and surrounding neighborhood. We introduced and passed legislation to study the high incidence of asthma in Manhattan and to prepare remediation plans. We also introduced a bill to implement air quality monitoring equipment at waste transfer stations. I've been an advocate for the environment, serving on the Environmental Legislators Caucus and earning a 100% record from the New York League of Conservation Voters on their environmental scorecard. One of my first bills signed into law was the Clean Waterways Fund. I was proud to co-sponsor and strongly support the New York State Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, implements the state's renewable energy goals for 2030, support disadvantaged communities, and invest in green energy projects that pay prevailing wages. Locally, we support our neighbors who are tremendous environmentalists, recyclers, and composters by funding our Upper Green Side nonprofit. We have hosted dozens of no-cost shredding events to support recycling and identity theft prevention efforts. We have a very special guest this evening. Joining me is NYPIRG's Blair Horner. Since September of 2015, he has been the executive director of the New York Public Interest Research Group. Starting in 1979, he's been employed almost exclusively at NYPIRG. In 1987, he became their legislative director. In his 30 years of working with NYPIRG, he has overseen community organizing activities and directed statewide issues-based campaigns. He's lobbied on a wide range of issues, including energy policy, political reform, government openness, and accountability, among others. He has written scores of reports examining issues, including redistricting, campaign finance, political ethics, bank fees, and auto insurance, among others. Thank you, Blair, for joining us this evening.
Thanks for having me. It's great to see you.
And what have you been focused on this legislative session?
Well, I assume in the same way for you, my head sometimes feels like it's going to explode as the budget process, the state budget process chugs along. The hearings, as you know, are wrapping up this week. And at the end of the month, it'll be pedal to the metal for the budget issues. And some of the things that we might talk about tonight dealing with environmental issues will be probably included in whatever ultimate state budget deal that comes together. So it's been fun, like they always are. This is sort of weird to not be able to get to see lawmakers face to face for another year. But you know, it's been, for me, I always enjoy doing this kind of work. And so it's great to see you, and thanks for having me.
Well, you're wonderful at the work that you do. In 2019, we passed the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, known as the CLCPA. Does this legislative act go far enough, in your opinion, in addressing climate change?
the law is very important because it sets New York on a trajectory toward, by the middle of the century, essentially not emitting greenhouse gases. And it has steps along the way. A certain percentage of the energy will have to be generated by renewable non-fossil fuel power. And there will be the sort of a trajectory in that direction. So the sort of the path is laid out in the law. But there's lots of things that still have to happen. So for example, how do you fund it all is one of the big ones. There's also a Climate Action Council who was, it was the creation of it was included in that law. And they have been, they put out a draft plan for how the CLCPA will be implemented in December. And it's open actually now for public comment. If your viewers wanted to Google, the Climate Action Council, New York State, you would see an opportunity to access the document and to submit comments between now and I believe the end of March. So it's a big, there's a lot of stuff happening. Anytime you try to completely re-engineer the power structure of the state in terms of, electricity, transportation, et cetera, you're going to end up with massive changes in the state society, but also in terms of the issues of, how do you pay for it? And I think that to me is sort of the big open issue still, is how do you create a system to ensure that the costs that are inevitably going to be incurred are tied to a funding stream that makes sense.
Right. And, just last week, Governor Hochul announced the start of New York's first offshore wind project. Why are wind projects so important in your view? And at this critical juncture, is it soon enough to be addressed in this current climate crisis, offshore wind?
Yeah, I mean, people that look at this stuff view the East Coast of the United States as one of the, in a sense, sort of the Saudi Arabia of wind. You have a lot of wind blowing through the ocean. It could power an enormous number of windmills that could make a big difference in terms of generating electricity for people's homes. And sort of the paradigm we were just talking about at the CLCPA, the paradigm of moving away from relying on fossil fuels for power inevitably means you're going to end up relying on electricity for power. And as the grid that powers that electricity becomes greener, like with this wind project, the smaller the fossil fuel footprint in New York State. And the way it sort of makes sense, there's power lines everywhere. There are such things as electric cars. We all live in houses that have light bulbs in them that turn on and turn off. And so there is a system in place. The question really is, how do you move things toward relying on electricity? And then how do you make the grid rely more and more on non-fossil fuel power? And the wind project that the governor talked about is a down payment toward a massive goal of generating electricity in New York State from now until the middle of the century. There's a massive goal that the state is going to rely on, the biggest 9,000 kilowatts, if I have the math right on that. And that power, this is a part of that happening. You can't build windmills to power the state in 1 year. You have to be building them out. And so the governor's plan, and that she unveiled last week, is another step down that 1,000-mile journey.
Recently, many people in New York City and in my district on the Upper East Side and Roosevelt Island have been experiencing abnormally high utility bills. We wrote a letter to the commissioner. I asked Chairman Christian to consider the high costs of the pandemic and to reconsider these sharp increases that are so difficult, especially on our fixed income residents. Can you offer any insight on the issue and how it relates to our environment and climate change?
It's related, obviously, to what's happening in the environment, because the electricity that New York relies on is by and large powered by fossil fuels. I mean, there are hydro plants and there are already some solar and wind, but a lot of the power really comes from the burning of natural gas, to some extent oil, but it's primarily from natural gas. And so as natural gas prices have spiked in recent months, to some extent due to the fact that it's colder, to some extent due to the fact that there are geopolitical problems that are occurring in Europe that some of your constituents may have heard about, that changes because it's a volatile sort of power source. But it's also, I think it highlights the electric bills highlights the need to look at how electricity is regulated in New York State. There's something called the Public Service Commission, which is supposed to be an independent entity, but their job is to not only regulate prices to protect consumers, but also to make sure that the companies make enough money to ensure that their long-term viability. So there's no real consumer advocate whose job it is to really represent consumers to sort of fight on that. And so there's a consumer side of this issue where I think right now, lawmakers are getting involved, such as yourself, to push the commission to protect consumers, but there really should be a consumer watchdog. And for years, we've pushed for the creation of something called a Citizens Utility Board, which would be a ratepayer organization to fight on behalf of ratepayers before the Public Service Commission. It existed under Governor Mario Cuomo, was killed under Governor George Pataki, and has not resurfaced. But maybe this is the time for people like yourself to start looking at ways to get ratepayers directly involved in that rate-paying process, because it says Public Service Commission, and the key word there is public.
Right. Well, that's an excellent idea to reconstitute that on behalf of consumers that need more transparency and a stronger voice. So I'd love to work closely with you on making that and others making it a reality. That's an excellent idea. There's a push to ban fossil fuel hookups in new construction. How will this help New York State to reach its goal of net zero greenhouse gas emissions in New York by 2050 and 100% carbon-free electricity by 2040?
Well, we talked about it a little bit before in terms of the need to move the way economic development moves forward from relying on fossil fuel power to electricity. And so buildings, the construction of new buildings is key. Not only do they have to be more energy efficient, but they have to have energy in them if people want to be able to live inside. And so where should that come from? The push for essentially electrification of buildings is, again, to rely on an increasingly green grid for power for people's homes. By the way, it's also safer because the more modern buildings are far less likely to catch fire if you're using electricity as compared to having an open flame in your gas-powered stove, for example. But so that one of the biggest sources, in fact, the biggest source in New York State in terms of New York City for sure, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions are buildings themselves. And so the idea that you can wean new construction away from relying on fossil fuels to generate power for those buildings to electricity can also help reduce the carbon footprint of the state. And like we've been talking about, there's no magic bullet on how to deal with global warming and the existential crisis it poses. But it's certainly, these types of proposals are another step in terms of taking that issue on.
How can we get our students more interested in advocating for our future?
I mean, they have the most at stake, right? They're of the adult cohort, the 18 to 24-year-olds, although not every college student is in that category anymore. I mean, we certainly have older students in there too, but you find primarily young adults going to college. They are the people who are going to they're going to experience the most whatever decisions we make now and the implications for those decisions. And they have a stake in the outcome, and yet they're the least likely to vote. They're the least likely to make campaign contributions, but they are the most likely to put their sort of sweat equity into the issues that they care about. And they tend to be the most idealistic. And so there needs to be mechanisms in place to sort of channel that civic engagement possibility for young adults to create a lifelong interest in their own democracy. Because you can see what happens now in America, where the people get turned off to their own democracy, and it becomes more and more the place where powerful interests or extremists get to play, and that further damages our democracy. And so it's really critically important that there be mechanisms in place, organizations within colleges, organizations, the state university and the city university have all sorts of organizations, student organizations that students direct themselves to get engaged in the issues of the day and to see how democracy works. They are less cynical if they understand how it works and how they can impact it.
Well, that's an excellent point. Yes. And can you tell us, in the state budget, what is your top priority at NYPIRG as it relates to climate and other issues besides the climate?
Well, this is the embarrassing part, right? I have a big head. At NYPIRG, we wear many hats. When it comes to, for example, we were just talking about higher education, right? So one of the issues we're very interested in higher education is when you look at the importance of higher education, not only in educating students, as we just described, but as an economic development engine. They are little engines of economic activity that you put money into. If the state puts money into it, they get back $8 for every dollar they put in. They every time, day in and day out, they generate future workforce, they generate future citizens, they generate economic activity. And yet the state has starved them for years. And so the state, we believe, and we're focusing on this, needs to make big investments this year because the state has the money to the state university system, the city university system, and those parts of the independent sector, the private colleges that are currently suffering. The big schools with the big endowments aren't suffering, but some of the little ones are, and they all play a role in the future of the state. On environmental issues, we are very much interested in funding things like we talked about before in terms of climate change. And we think it's the fossil fuel industry that should be picking up the tab, not the taxpayers. It is, after all, the fossil fuel industry, the big oil companies that knew for decades what was happening in greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. And they lied to everyone and funded their toadies to try to spin the issue away from their responsibility. We think they should pay. And we think that there should be, and there are mechanisms to make them pay so it's not easily passed on to the cost of consumers. So those are two big ones. We also care a lot about healthcare. Obviously, in the context of a pandemic, the idea of not having health insurance or having inadequate health insurance really is crystal clear as to the problems that entails. So again, I could go on, but it's only a half-hour show, and I don't want to put anyone to sleep.
Well, no, it's absolutely fascinating, and I'm just such a big fan of NYPIRG and you and your team's work. Tell us a little bit about NYPIRG, the organization, some of the biggest successes that you've lobbied for, and if a person wanted to get involved with NYPIRG, how would they do that?
NYPIRG was started almost 50 years ago. 1973, it was incorporated. 50th anniversary is coming up. At the time, there were student activists at Queens College, Syracuse University, University of Buffalo that sort of joined forces to create the Public Interest Research Group in New York. And the whole idea of a PIRG is to give students the opportunity to impact public policy, not only on their campus, but in the world at large. It grew out of the Civil Rights Movement, the war movement in the early 70s, women's movement. The board of directors were all college and university students elected from the school. So my bosses, despite the fact that I'm as old as I am, are all college students elected from the schools that are part of NYPIRG. And so there are ways for people to find out more about what's happening on our campuses and also what are happening in our work in the community. We also have thousands of community members. And you can, of course, go to our website, nypirg.org, nypirg.org. I mean, the biggest success is it's so hard because it's sort of, how do you measure that stuff? So we were very involved, for example, in creating the system of public financing in New York City so that average people could run for office, which we're very proud of. We worked very hard and were, I would argue, instrumental in passage of a lot of the anti-smoking measures that protect non-smokers from cigarette smoke. There was a study done by the health department about 5 years after that law passed in the early aughts that said that there were 30,000 fewer heart attacks as a result of passing that law. And so when you look at your life, when I look back, most of my life now is in the rearview mirror, kinds of things where you can help save people's lives and health loom larger, but still, yet the democracy has to work, and democracy is a work in progress. The issues of making our democracy work better also do that. And then there's many, many issues, as you mentioned earlier, that we work on. So we're very interested in lots of different things. As I said before, I have a big head. You can all see that on television. And in terms of finding out more about us, going to nypirg.org to do that.
Well, it's a wonderful, wonderful organization. And I want to just segue back into climate control. We've taken steps to set goals for our clean air. Getting to those goals will be very difficult. On zero emission vehicles, is NYPIRG advocating for the rollout of these vehicles?
The short answer is yes. We worked on and supported the bill that basically passed, became law, that's going to phase out the sale of fossil fuel powered cars in the year 2035, which is consistent with what California is doing, Norway. It's all happening all across the world. China's even looking at it in terms of, because everyone understands transportation is a big component of greenhouse gas emissions. Cars are being part of that, right? So yes, we're very involved in that. There are proposals in New York State to make it easier for people to buy electric vehicles. The big issue is going to be the charging stations. And so the state, I think, is going to have to provide, this is sort of gets back to what we talked about before, the costs of implementing the CLCPA. Is going to really have to help invest and stimulate more and more charging stations for electric cars, because that is not that far down the road, excuse the pun, in terms of when people are going to all be driving electric cars. You think about places like Manhattan, where do you put those charging stations? You can't put them necessarily, you should put them in parking garages, but people shouldn't have to pay to get the power. They should pay to buy the power. And so that whole system that you're going to have to create in places like densely populated areas like New York City, how do you create electric vehicle charging stations that make sense financially, economically, and physically in terms of people being able to drive and use them? I mean, that's going to be a real challenge. I mean, it's even hard now to find gas stations in New York City, but it's certainly, if everyone's driving around electric vehicles, we're going to need charging stations. We're going to need to find them pretty easily.
Right. Well, that's a very good point. I know in the state budget, there's language for all public buses to be electric, and our public school buses, and funding for that as well. So, but tomorrow we conclude with our last budget hearing of this legislative cycle. It's been really expedited due to the change in the legislative redistricting that occurred this year. And so we're looking to have an on-time budget by April 1. So what do you see as the main change or the feeling in Albany now that we have new leadership in the city of New York and we have new leadership at the state?
Well, I mean, I've been involved, and you mentioned earlier, I've been involved in Albany since 1984 for NYPIRG by and large. And so I've been around here a long time. And it is sort of an astonishing turn of events that you have Democratic supermajorities in both houses, and 2 of the 3 legislative leaders are women. It's sort of it seemed to just happen overnight. It essentially did really overnight in terms of the politics of it. Having a new governor brings fresh blood, I think, into the state. And of course, she still has to run for election in the fall, and who knows what happens there. But it changes things. I mean, one of the things I've seen in administrations when they get into their 3rd term, they start to run out of gas in terms of ideas, not necessarily people. People all work very hard and they're all smart, but you become sort of weighed down with the baggage of all the decisions you made in the preceding 2 terms. And I think that you saw that happening in the previous administration. I saw it in other administrations as well. And I think having a new governor sort of jolts the place in a way that helps get things done. So on top of it, of course, it's the pandemic, right? And so for the last 2.5 sessions, we've been all sort of dealing with each other remotely. And that's weird because politics is really about relationships, lobbying too. And it's hard to have them from afar. So it's been unique in that way in terms of both the way the state political dynamism has changed, and just sort of at the granular level to sort of interpersonal work that has to happen to make things happen in Albany.
Do you think we'll get back to the in-person lobbying at the state capitol and in our legislative office buildings?
Yeah, well, eventually, I'm a hopeful guy. To me, it'll be an interesting question for you folks as to how do you open up if it really looks like we've achieved through vaccine and exposure some sort of herd immunity. How do you, because you can't just partly open, right? I mean, you can't say, okay, just the lobbyists can come in. It's the public has a constitutional right to petition the government. And so how do you as lawmakers make that decision on when you open up? Probably a function of, what's going on in the world. But it's going to be interesting. I'm hoping because I think it's very important for our elected officials to meet with people, all different sort of perspectives, and for the public to have their voices heard. And it's harder to do that on Zoom, although it is easier in the sense that people don't have to schlep to Albany.
Especially with in the snowstorm, but March is coming and warmer weather, and so I'm encouraging my constituents to jump on a bus and come up to Albany by the hundreds and host those rallies out on the grass in front of the Capitol and let your voices be heard. And so I just came back from Texas, where I spoke at the funeral of the Roe versus Wade attorney, Sarah Weddington, who I remember in 2019 came to Albany to the state capitol. And as the lead sponsor of the Equal Rights Amendment in the Assembly, I want to encourage my viewers and my constituents to get involved in government, making your voices heard and coming on up to Albany. So I want to thank you, Blair, for coming on. It's fascinating talking to you. You have a wealth of experience and knowledge and expertise. And we as legislators really depend on you and your organization for information as we craft bills and work closely with you to do that. So thank you again for coming on this evening. It's been an informative discussion, and I look forward to continuing the fight for our environment and against climate change in the Assembly. I want to thank our viewers for watching Rise Up with Rebecca Seawright on the Manhattan Neighborhood Network.
First you go down and then you go